The envelope had been on the table for the third day, white and thick, with a golden border around the edges. I put off opening it, as if I sensed another disappointment from my son waiting inside. Damien sent me letters rarely, usually formal holiday greetings or short notes saying he was busy and wouldn't be able to visit. Since Martha's death 3 years ago, our already chilly relationship had cooled into a polite estrangement. I took the envelope in my hands and ran my finger over its surface. The handwriting on the address was feminine, neat, and a little angular. Celeste. She'd come into Damien's life 2 years ago, and since then, my son had become even more distant. He used to at least call on Sundays asking about my health out of courtesy. Now even that was gone. Tearing open the envelope, I pulled out a dainty embossed card. Damien, Captain, and Celeste Brody invite you to share in the joy of their marriage. Date, time, address of a restaurant in downtown Richmond. Everything looked expensive and impeccable, just like Celeste herself. But at the bottom in small handwriting was a note. Papa, in view of your health and age, Celeste and I feel that this celebration may be too tiring for you. It would be better to celebrate this event with your family later, in a more relaxed setting. Love, Damien. My state of health, I grinned bitterly. In my 74 years, I felt pretty decent. My blood pressure was normal, thanks to the pills. My back sometimes ached from working in the garden. But overall, I was much more alert than many of my peers. 40 years as a school principal had taught me to recognize lies, and now I could see them with the naked eye. Damien didn't want me at his wedding. I set aside the invitation and made my way to the living room, where there were pictures on the mantelpiece. Damien as a baby, a smiling boy with missing front teeth. Damien in his graduation suit, serious and already a little aloof. Damien with Martha on her last birthday when she could still get out of bed. He'd come less and less often since her death, and in the last year we'd only seen each other at Christmas, and that he'd been in a hurry to leave, citing plans with Celeste. Celeste Brody, a woman of 38, a real estate agent, as she introduced herself. Tall, well-groomed, with short blonde hair and cold gray eyes. She spoke the right words, smiled in all the right places, but in her presence I always felt superfluous. Damien looked at her with adoration, like a teenager falling in love for the first time. At his 45 years old, it seemed almost awkward. I remembered their first meeting at my house. Damien had brought her to dinner, obviously wanting to impress her. Celeste had been impeccably polite, admiring the decor, praising my story about my years at the school. But I noticed her gaze sliding around the rooms, as if assessing the value of the furniture and paintings. As they were leaving, she said, "Your father has a beautiful house. Old mansions like that are very valuable on the market right now." Damien laughed and hugged her. "Daddy in this house isn't going to move anywhere, is he, Daddy?" I nodded, but something in Celeste's tone made me wary. After that, Damien started gently making small talk about whether the house was too big for me, whether I was having a hard time maintaining it. He offered to help me find something smaller, a cozy apartment or townhouse. I'd say I could manage for now, and the subject would die down for a while. But Celeste returned to it again and again, always tactfully, always with concern in her voice. "Nolan, you need to think about your comfort. At your age, it's important not to overburden yourself with the cares of a large household." Gradually, I began to realize what was going on. Damien worked for an insurance company, earning a decent salary, but not so much that he could afford a luxurious life. Celeste was clearly used to a certain level of comfort. My house was worth a lot, and when I died, everything was supposed to go to the sole heir. But I obviously didn't want to wait. Talk of moving increased after the engagement. Damien became more persistent. Celeste chimed in and offered her services as an agent. "I'll find you the perfect match, and we can sell your house for top dollar." I kept refusing, and then their visits became less frequent. The last time they came was at Easter, and the atmosphere was strained. Celeste no longer hid her irritation at my stubbornness, and Damien looked confused, torn between his fiancée and his father. That Easter day, everything went wrong from the start. Celeste showed up in a white suit that clearly cost more than my monthly pension, and with a bouquet of lilies that she'd placed in a vase, having previously thrown my humble tulips out of the garden. "Nolan, I hope you don't mind, but those flowers looked a little wilted." Damien remained silent. though a year ago he would have stood up for his father's flowers. Over lunch, Celeste talked about her success in her work, the expensive houses she was selling, the high society clients. Her voice sounded too loud in my quiet dining room, where Martha and I were used to dining in near silence, enjoying each other's company. Damien listened breathlessly, as if every word she said was a revelation. When I tried to throw in a few words about my work at the school, Celeste nodded politely and immediately switched to another topic. By the way, Nolan, I recently sold a house not far from here. You know the old Harris mansion on Maple Street? The buyers offered an amount that exceeded the original appraisal by 30%. Can you imagine the opportunities in the real estate market right now? She looked at me with a meaningful smile. Your house, by the way, is in a very up-and-coming neighborhood. I'm sure I could find some great buyers. Damien backed her up. Dad, maybe we should at least consider our options. Celeste really is a professional at what she does. And the house is really big for one person. I looked at my son and saw something new in his eyes. Greed. Not angry, not aggressive, but the very palpable greed of a man who had already mentally spent money he didn't already have. This is the house my father built. This is where I was born. This is where the best years of my life with your mother were spent, I said slowly. This is where you grew up, Damien. Remember the swings in the backyard? Remember when you and I painted the fence in the summer of 2001? Damien lowered his eyes. Of course I remember, Dad. But that's all in the past. We need to think about the future. About practicality. About practicality, I repeated, and realized my son was lost to me completely. After that Easter meeting, they stopped coming altogether. Damien called occasionally, but the conversations grew shorter and more formal. Celeste had apparently decided that persuasion was futile and had opted for Cold War tactics. If the old man does not want to voluntarily vacate the house, let him live alone, without family, without grandchildren, which they will certainly have. Now the invitation with the postscript explained everything. I was an unwelcome guest at my own family wedding. Too old, too uncomfortable, too alive for their plans. Celeste had apparently convinced Damien that my presence might ruin their celebration. Perhaps she was afraid I'd say the wrong thing in front of her friends and coworkers, or maybe she just didn't want to see someone who was interfering with her dreams of getting rich quick. I looked at the invitation again. The wedding was to take place a week later, on Saturday at 7:30 in the evening. Magnolia Gardens Restaurant, one of Richmond's most expensive establishments. Celeste liked to impress. I wonder who was paying for this gala. Damien obviously couldn't afford such luxuries on his salary. Perhaps the bride's parents, or Celeste herself, hoping to recoup the cost through her future inheritance. The sun was setting outside the window, coloring the sky orange and pink. I sat in Martha's chair, the one she loved so much, and thought about how our family had changed. We had once been close, at least I thought so. Damien was an obedient child, good at school, not much trouble. Maybe that was the problem. He never rebelled, never argued, just silently accepted all my decisions. Martha used to say he was too soft, that he needed to learn to take a stand. Now it seemed he had finally learned, but he was using that skill against me. Martha, if she were alive, none of this would be happening. She knew how to find common ground with Damien, knew how to gently steer him in the right direction without causing him to protest. I was too direct, too categorical. 40 years as a school principal had taught me to give orders and expect them to be obeyed. But children are not students and families are not schools. I remember when Martha got sick, liver cancer, diagnosed too late. Damien was still visiting us regularly, helping us with doctors, with medication. But when it became clear that Martha was dying, he started to drift away. Not physically, he still came, sat by her bedside, held her hand. But emotionally, it was as if he had shut down, built a protective wall around himself so he wouldn't feel the pain. After the funeral, that wall only strengthened. Damien helped organize the wake, sort through Martina's things, file the paperwork. But he did it all mechanically, as if he were doing a job. And then Celeste showed up, and he came alive. Suddenly, brightly, almost painfully, like a 50-year-old who'd fallen in love for the first time. The phone rang, interrupting my musings. Damien's number came up on the display. I stared at the ringing machine for a while, then picked up. Hey, Dad, did you get our invitation? My son's voice sounded strained, as if he'd rehearsed this conversation. Got it, thanks. Dad, I wanted to explain. Celeste and I are just worried about your health. The wedding is going to be long, lots of people. Music. You thought 74 years old was too old for one night at a restaurant? That's not the point. It's just, you know, Damien fell silent, and I heard a woman's voice say something in the background. Celeste, of course. No, son, I don't understand. Explain it to me. Dad, well, don't make it hard. We just want the day to go perfectly. Lots of Celeste's coworkers, important people. You know how it is at events like this. Can I embarrass you? Of course not. It's just, we thought it would be better. Celeste's voice in the background again, more insistent. Okay, Damien, I got it. Have a good time. Dad, no offense, please. We'll definitely see you after the honeymoon. Celebrate properly. I hung up before I could listen. Offended? Resent what? That my only son doesn't want his father at his wedding? That the woman he loves thinks I'm a liability? That the family I've spent a lifetime building is crumbling like a house of cards? I stood up and walked to the window. The roses Martha had planted were blooming in the yard. She used to say roses were a memory. They would bloom every year, reminding me of those who loved them. I wonder if the new owners will take care of Martha's roses, or will they uproot them to plant something more fashionable? It all started on a rainy October morning 2 years ago. I remember that day vividly, because that was when I first encountered the side of Celeste that she'd been so careful to hide from Damien. Martha had died only 6 months before, and I was still reeling from the loss. The house seemed too big and empty, every room a reminder of her, but the thought of selling it never even crossed my mind. At 10:30 in the morning, the doorbell rang. On the threshold stood an unfamiliar woman of about 35, in a strict gray suit, with short blonde hair and a businesslike smile. She was holding a leather briefcase and an umbrella from which water was still dripping. Good afternoon. My name is Christine Wade. I'm a real estate agent with Premium Estate. May I speak with you for a few minutes? The voice was pleasant, professional, with a slight southern accent. The woman held herself confidently, but not aggressively. I invited her in thinking she had the wrong address, or one of the neighbors had decided to sell the house, and she was walking around the neighborhood offering her services. Mr. Captain, I have a very interesting proposition for you, she said, settling into a chair in the living room and pulling a file folder out of her briefcase. I represent a client who is interested in buying your particular house. He's willing to make a very generous offer. I raised my eyebrows. I'm sorry, but my house is not for sale, nor has it ever been for sale. That's why the offer is so favorable, she smiled. My client is a serious investor. He's buying up properties in the area for a major development project. Your house is in a strategic location, and he's willing to pay well above market value. She opened a folder and showed me several sheets with calculations and pictures of houses in the neighborhood. Everything looked very professional, with stamps, signatures, and official letterhead. You see, Mr. Captain, the city officials have already approved a project to build a new housing development on this block. Your house, unfortunately, falls within the demolition zone. Of course, you can wait for a forced buyout, but then the compensation will be much less. She pulled out another document, supposedly a resolution of the city council on the reconstruction of the neighborhood. Seals, signatures, everything as it should be. But something about the story didn't add up. I'd lived in Richmond all my life, knew many in city government, and no one had ever mentioned any large-scale projects in our neighborhood. How much, I asked, determined to find out what she was getting at. $250,000, cash. My client is ready to close the deal within a week. I almost laughed. My house was worth at least $500,000, and given its historical value and location, even more. $250,000 was frankly a laughable sum. Ms. Wade, I'm afraid your client is not well versed in the local real estate market. My house is worth twice that much. I understand your surprise, she nodded without losing her composure. But you have to consider the circumstances. In a forced buyout, the city won't pay more than $150,000, and litigation could drag on for years. At your age, that's not a pleasant prospect. At your age, the phrase sounded like a threat. The woman looked at me sympathetically, but there was something else in her eyes. Cold calculation. Beside, she continued, the house needs serious repairs. The roof, the heating, The wiring, all of it, will require a significant investment. And in the case of a forced buyout, the city will not reimburse the cost of repairs. I stood up and walked around the room. The roof had been repaired 3 years ago. The heating was working properly and the wiring had only recently been changed. But the woman spoke as confidently as if she really knew the condition of my house. Ms. Wade, may I see your agent identification card? She held out a plastic card to me without hesitation. Christine Wade, licensed real estate agent, premium estate company, license number, photo. Everything looked authentic. I need time to think about it, I said. Sure, but don't take too long. My client is considering several options, and if you refuse, he may choose another site for the project. Then a forced buyout will become inevitable. After she left, I sat down at my computer and started checking the information. Premium Estate existed. It had a website and an office in the city center. But when I called there and asked to be connected to Christine Wade, I was told that they had no such employee. Moreover, no major development projects were planned in our neighborhood. The next day I went to City Hall. An old acquaintance of mine, Robert Finch, had worked in the planning department for 20 years. He looked at the documents Ms. Wade had left behind and shook his head. Nolan, this is a forgery, and a pretty crude one at that. The seal is wrong, the signatures are fake, even the letterhead is wrong. Someone's trying to trick you. But why? What's the point of offering such a small amount? Well, think about it. Someone finds out you're recently widowed, probably in a difficult financial situation, not versed in the legal intricacies. You get scared of a forced foreclosure, agree to a quick half-price sale, and then this real estate is resold at its real value. Net profit of $250,000. Fraud. I felt angry and curious at the same time. Who was this woman really, and how did she know about me? 3 days later, Christine Wade called again. Mr. Captain, my client is beginning to lose patience. He's willing to increase the offer to $270,000, but that's the final price. Ms. Wade, would your client be interested in my neighboring property? It's not a bad house there either. Unfortunately, no. It's your house he wants, your lot. It's a special location, you know. Special location. I looked out the window at my yard, at Martha's roses, at the old oak tree under which Damien and I had once built a treehouse. What was so special about this place for a con artist? Okay, let's meet tomorrow and discuss the details. Fine, I'll come to your place at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with the contract. The next day at 2:30, I called the police. Detective Michael Green promised to arrive at 2 o'clock and wait for the fraudster. But she didn't show up. She didn't call. She didn't return my calls. She just vanished into thin air. I tried to find the real Christine Wade. It turned out that an agent with that name did exist, but she worked for a different company and looked completely different. The picture on the fake ID belonged to some photo model from an advertising agency. Detective Green said fraud schemes like this are quite common. Scammers target elderly people who have recently lost a spouse, research their financial situation through public records, and try to intimidate or defraud them. Victims usually don't go to the police, embarrassed by their naivete. You did the right thing to verify the information, he said. A lot of people in your shoes would have believed it and lost half the value of the house. I thought then that the story was over. The scammer realized she couldn't fool me and switched to another victim. But about a month later, Damien brought home a new girl, Celeste Brody. Different hair, different clothes, different name, but same gray eyes, same voice, same smile. I recognized her immediately, but I decided to keep quiet for now. I wanted to understand what she was up to this time. The evening passed in pleasant conversation. Celeste talked about her work in real estate, about how she'd met Damien in a cafe where she'd gone for coffee between meetings with clients. She was charming, smart, attentive, and never let on that we'd met before. When they left, I walked them to their car. Celeste got into the car first and Damien lingered to say goodbye. Do you like her, Dad? A very nice girl, I answered cautiously. I think she's the one. You know, after Mom, I thought I couldn't love anyone else. But Celeste, she's special. Special. I looked at the woman who tried to cheat me out of $250,000 and was now seducing my son, and I thought Damien was right. She really is special. After they left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about what to do. Tell Damien the truth? But what proof do I have? I'd given the fake IDs back to the police. No record of the conversations, no witnesses, and Celeste is probably denying everything. Besides, I saw the way Damien looked at her. He was happy for the first time since his mom died. Is it worth ruining that happiness for a suspicion that might turn out to be wrong? Perhaps the encounter with the rogue was an accident and Celeste was a completely different person. But time proved me right. Celeste was indeed the same Christine Wade. Only now she chose a more subtle strategy. Instead of blatant deception, she decided to get my house through my son. And by all accounts, the plan was working. Saturday morning, the morning of the wedding, I woke up at 7:30 without an alarm clock. The sun was shining outside the window, promising a warm October day. I lay in bed looking up at the ceiling and thought about the fact that today my only son would be getting married without me. There was a silence in the house that only old people have in their homes. A silence that is not broken by children's laughter, hurried footsteps, calls from friends, or the noise of the TV in the next room. I got up and made my way to the bathroom. The reflection in the mirror showed me a gray-haired man of 74 with deep wrinkles around his eyes and a tired expression. When I was younger, Martha used to say I had kind eyes. Now they held the bitterness of a man who had realized that family could betray as easily as strangers. After breakfast, I sat down in my office and pulled a folder of documents from my desk drawer. There were copies of the forged papers Christine Wade had brought me 2 years ago, recordings of my conversations with Detective Green, and a picture of the real Christine Wade I'd found on the internet. All this time I'd been collecting evidence, hoping I'd never need it, hoping that Celeste would turn out to be just a rogue-looking woman, that my suspicions were unfounded. But the more time passed, the more I became convinced I was right. Celeste knew too much about my home, my habits, my daily routine. She was interested in my health, my financial situation, my future plans. It all seemed like the concern of a future daughter-in-law, but I sensed a cold calculation beneath the concern. When Damien first brought up the engagement, I tried to gently probe what he knew about Celeste's past. It turned out to be very little. She told him she grew up in a small town in North Carolina, lost her parents early, went to college to study economics, then moved to Richmond and got into real estate. No details, no specific dates, names, places. A vague story, impossible to verify. I tried to find information about Celeste Brody online. The social media profile was only 2.5 years old, right after we met Christine Wade. The photos started from the period of her relationship with Damien. Before that, there was a void, as if Celeste had materialized out of nowhere. The real estate agency where she worked told me that Celeste came to them a year ago with excellent references from out of town and quickly became one of their best employees. Recommendations that were probably as fake as Christine Wade's credentials. Now, sitting in my office with a folder of evidence in my hands, I've made my final decision. I'm going to Damien's wedding. Not because I want to ruin his happiness, but because I can't let him marry a cheater. He has a right to know the truth about the woman he's about to make his wife. I went up to the second floor and opened the suit closet. There, hanging there, was my best dark blue suit that I had bought for Martha's 60th birthday party. She said then that I looked like a movie star in it. After she died, I only wore it to friends' funerals and formal events at school. Today, it would come in handy for my son's wedding. As I got dressed, I thought about how the concept of family has changed over my lifetime. When I was a kid, family meant everything. My father worked on the railroad. My mother ran the household and raised 4 children. We were not wealthy, but we were friendly. Sunday dinners at the big table when all the relatives gathered. Grandpa told stories about the war. Grandma read letters from cousins scattered all over the country. Children played in the yard. Adults solved family problems together. Then I married Martha, and we started our own family. At first, everything followed the same script. Work, home, child, plans for the future. Damien was a welcome and beloved son. We read books to him, taught him how to ride a bike, went to school plays in which he played trees and clouds. An ordinary, middle-class American family with its little joys and problems. But something went wrong. Perhaps I was too strict a father. Maybe I spent too much time at school dealing with other people's kids' problems and too little time focusing on my own son. Maybe Damien just grew up to be a different person than I expected. He never rebelled, never argued, never expressed his opinions. He just quietly withdrew, building an invisible wall around himself. After high school, he went to college in another state, then found a job and stayed there for a few more years. He came home for the holidays, called on Sundays, but he became more and more a polite acquaintance than a son. When he returned to Richmond, I hoped we'd grow closer, but the time was lost. A gulf of misunderstanding grew between us that neither shared memories nor blood ties could bridge. Martha tried to mediate between us. She explained to me that Damien was just different, that not all children had to be copies of their parents. She told him that I loved him, I just didn't know how to show it. Maybe if she had lived longer, we would have been able to find common ground. But when she died, the last link was severed. Damien was now married to a woman who only saw him as a path to easy money, and I was the only one who knew about it, the only one who could stop this disaster. I finished dressing and looked at myself in the mirror. The suit fit well, my tie was tied straight, my gray hair neatly combed. I looked like a respectable elderly gentleman invited to a gala event. No one would have thought I was about to ruin someone's wedding. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I left the house and got into my old but reliable sedan. It was almost 20 years old, but it had served me well all that time. Damien had hinted more than once that it was time for me to upgrade to something safer and more modern. Maybe he was right, but I'd grown accustomed to my car like an old friend. The drive to the restaurant took about 40 minutes. I drove slowly, enjoying the fall scenery of Richmond. The trees were golden red, the leaves swirling in the wind and laying a colorful carpet on the road. Such beauty and so little time to enjoy it. Magnolia Gardens restaurant was located in the historic downtown area, in a 19th century building surrounded by old magnolia trees and manicured gardens. It was a really beautiful wedding venue, expensive and prestigious. I parked in the far corner of the parking lot, where my car was not conspicuous among the expensive cars of the guests. Before entering, I stood at the entrance for a few minutes, gathering my wits. Through these doors, I would enter as an unwelcome guest at my own son's wedding, as a man who has been asked to stay home because of age and health, as a father who is embarrassed in front of important people. But I will also enter as a man who knows the truth about the woman who is tricking her way into our family, the truth about who Celeste Brody really is. I pulled a file folder from my inside jacket pocket and checked once more to make sure everything was in place. Copies of the forged papers, notes of conversations with the police, a picture of the real Christine Wade. Everything was ready for a conversation that would change the lives of many people. The lobby of the restaurant was decorated with white roses and gold ribbons. Guests in smart suits and evening gowns walked leisurely toward the party room. I recognized some of Damien's colleagues from the insurance company, but most of the people were strangers to me. Celestine friends and acquaintances I knew nothing about. No one paid any attention to me. An older man in a nice suit among the other middle-aged guests didn't seem like an alien element. I walked into the hall and took a seat at one of the far tables, from where I had a clear view of the whole ceremony. The room was decorated in classic-style white tablecloths, silver candlesticks, fresh flowers on each table. At the far end stood an arch decorated with roses, under which the ceremony was to take place. The musicians were tuning instruments. The waiters were arranging glasses and cutlery. Gradually, the hall filled with guests. I saw a few of Damien's coworkers, former classmates I remembered from when I was a kid, but most of them were strangers to me. Elegant ladies in expensive clothes, men in impeccable suits, young people who looked as if they'd stepped out of the pages of fashion magazines. At 7:30, Damien showed up. He was in a black tuxedo with a white shirt and a golden bow tie, his hair neatly styled, his face shaved to a shine. He looked happy and excited, as a groom should on his wedding day. His friend Alex stood next to him, acting as best man. Damien looked around the room, smiling at the guests and nodding at the people he knew. When his gaze stopped at my table, the smile on his face faded. He blinked as if he couldn't believe his eyes, then quickly turned away and said something to Alex. He looked in my direction too and frowned. I sat quietly in my seat, making no sign. Damien might have considered my appearance a surprise, but he shouldn't have seen it as a threat. For now I was just a father attending his son's wedding, despite my request to stay home. At 7 o'clock, the music started and everyone stood up. Celeste entered the hall surrounded by her bridesmaids. She wore a white dress that undoubtedly cost more than my monthly pension. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo, her makeup was flawless, and her smile was radiant. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale, and only I knew what rotten soul lurked behind that beauty. When Celeste saw me, her face contorted with horror for a moment. She quickly pulled herself together and smiled again, but I noticed how her shoulders tensed, how the hands holding the bouquet trembled. She recognized me and realized that her past had caught up with her at the worst possible time. The ceremony began. The priest spoke solemn words of love, fidelity, and family bonds. Damien and Celeste stood under the archway, holding hands and looking into each other's eyes. It was a touching picture to everyone there. Two lovers who vowed to be together for the rest of their lives. Only I knew that one of those vows was spoken with false lips. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Damien and Celeste said their vows, exchanged rings, and kissed to the applause of the guests. I sat in the far corner of the room, watching as an outsider. No one present knew that the father of the groom, who had been asked not to come, was in the hall. To them, I was just another elderly guest, perhaps a distant relative or family friend. After the formal part, the buffet program began. Guests mingled to form small groups. Waiters served champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I took a glass and slowly walked around the hall, listening to the conversations and observing people. Most of the guests were discussing the beauty of the ceremony, the outfits, and the newlyweds' plans for their honeymoon. The usual small talk that accompanies any celebration. Damien was surrounded by co-workers and friends who congratulated him and shared advice about married life. He looked happy, but I noticed his gaze occasionally sliding restlessly around the room, looking for me. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away and tried to absorb himself in the conversation with the guests. Celeste held herself more confidently. She moved gracefully from group to group, accepting congratulations and introducing Damien to her friends. There was no hint of excitement or anxiety in her demeanor. The professional con artist knew how to control her emotions and adjust to any situation. Only I knew that behind that mask of calmness lurked the tension of a predator who sensed danger. About half an hour after the start of the buffet, a young man in an expensive suit approached me. The face seemed familiar, but I couldn't remember where we'd met. "Excuse me, aren't you Mr. Captain?" he asked politely. "Yes, that's me. Bradley Hawkins, I worked at your school as a history teacher 5 years ago. Do you remember me?" Of course, I recognized him now. Bradley was one of the best young teachers I had ever had working under me. Smart, dedicated, popular with the students. He left the school when he got a job offer at a private college. "Bradley, of course I remember. How are you doing? What brings you to this wedding?" "I'm a friend of Celeste's," he smiled. "We met at one of the educational seminars last year. She's a very interesting woman, knows a lot about real estate and investments. How did you end up here?" That was an interesting question. Apparently, Celeste wasn't introducing me to the guests as the father of the groom. I wonder what legend she'd come up with to explain my presence. "Damien is my son," I answered simply. Bradley raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Your son?" But Celeste said Damien has no close relatives, that he's practically an orphan. Practically an orphan. So Celeste had already buried me in the eyes of her friends. A convenient theory that explained why the groom spoke so little about his family. "As you can see, rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated," I grinned. Bradley looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Perhaps I misunderstood something." "That's okay. Family relationships can be complicated." We talked some more about his work and mutual acquaintances, after which Bradley apologized and retreated to the other guests. But I could see that our conversation had gotten him thinking. The seeds of doubt had been sown. An hour later, the banquet began. The guests were seated at the set tables. The waiters served the first courses. The sommelier poured the wine. I took a seat at a table of mostly older people, relatives and family friends whom Celeste considered safe. She obviously hoped I would sit quietly in the company of old people and not interfere with the festivities. Next to me was an elderly lady named Dorothy, Celeste's aunt, as she introduced herself. A lovely woman in her 70s who was clearly delighted to have the opportunity to talk to a peer. "Celeste is such a smart girl," she said, sipping her wine. "Always been an independent girl. She had to grow up early after her parents died, but she managed. She went to school, got a good job. Now she's married well." I listened to her story with interest. Celeste had created the same legend for her relatives as she had for Damien, the orphan girl who'd achieved everything on her own. A convenient story that elicited sympathy and explained the lack of details about the past. How long ago did her parents die? I asked cautiously. Oh, it was so long ago. Celeste was still in high school then. A car accident, very tragic. Poor girl was left all alone. Dorothy clearly believed the story. Perhaps Celeste really had lost her parents when she was young, or maybe her aunt was part of her legend. Either way, there was no way to verify this information without serious investigation. The banquet continued. Food was served, toasts were made, and music played. Damien and Celeste sat at the head table, accepting congratulations and looking like a happy couple. I waited patiently for my moment. According to the program on each table, the guest speeches were scheduled for 9 o'clock in the evening, after the main courses. At about 9:30, a waiter approached me. Mr. Captain, the bride would like to speak to you. She's waiting in the small parlor. I stood up and followed the waiter into a small room off the main hall. Celeste stood at the window with her back to me. She looked even more beautiful in profile, chiseled features, graceful neck, royal posture. If I hadn't known of her true nature, I would have understood my son's crush. Hello, Nolan, she said without turning around. Didn't expect to see you here. And I didn't expect to see Christine Wade here, I replied calmly. She turned and looked me in the eye. There was no fear or embarrassment on her face, just cold determination. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. 2 years ago, you tried to buy my house for half price, posing as an agent for a non-existent company. Remember the forced buyout documents? You have no proof. I do, and tonight Damien will learn the truth about his wife. Celeste stepped closer. Sparks of steel appeared in her eyes. Listen to me carefully, old man. Damien is happy. For the first time in years, he's truly happy. And you want to ruin that for your fantasies? They're not fantasies, and you know it. Even if your suspicions are correct, so what? I'm in love with Damien. Yes, I may have been driven by pragmatic considerations at first, but that's all changed now. We were made for each other. You were made for her to have my house after I die. Celeste laughed, but the laugh sounded artificial. Your house? Who needs it? Your old house. Damien makes enough to buy the best house in town. We don't need your inheritance. Then why were you so insistent on asking me to move? Out of concern for you. You living alone in a huge house is dangerous at your age. What if something happens to you? Who will find you? She was a good actress. It was worth it to admit. There was genuine concern in her voice and concern in her eyes. If I didn't know the truth, I would have believed her sincerity. Nolan, she continued more gently, I understand this is hard for you. You've lost your wife. Your son is estranged from you. You feel alone and unwanted. But that's no reason to ruin someone else's happiness. Someone else's? Damien is my son. Then think of him. Think about what would happen if you told your side of the story. Even if someone believes you, what then? Damien will be left alone, broken and deceived. Is that what you want for your only son? She was right about one thing. The truth would hurt Damien, but lying would cause even more pain in the future. It's better to let him know the truth now than in a few years when you disappear with his money. I'm not disappearing anywhere, Celeste said firmly. No matter what happened in the past, I'm going to be a good wife now. Damien will be happy. Give me a chance to prove it. We looked at each other in tense silence. Then Celeste sighed and sat back in her chair. Okay, I'll tell you the truth. Yes, I am the woman who came to see you 2 years ago. Yes, I tried to buy your house cheap. But do you know why? I had debts. Big debts to people you don't want to mess with. I needed money fast and I was desperate. She spoke quieter, almost a whisper, and there was indeed a note of desperation in her voice. When the plan didn't work, I thought it was over. But then I met Damien and everything changed. For the first time in my life, I felt safe. For the first time, I had someone who loved me for no reason but for nothing. Can you understand that? I could, but it didn't change anything. Celeste, even if everything you say is true, Damien has a right to know about it. He has the right to make his own decision. And if he leaves me, then it's fate's will. She stood up and walked to the door. Then do as you see fit. But know this, you're ruining your son's life. After she left, I stayed in the small living room for a few more minutes, getting my thoughts in order. Talking to Celeste hadn't changed anything. Maybe she really had changed. Maybe she loved Damien wholeheartedly now. But you can't change the past, and the future is built on a foundation of truth, not lies. When I returned to the hall, the guest speeches were just beginning. Alex's best man spoke of friendship and loyalty. The bridesmaids told sweet stories about Celeste. Damien's co-workers wished the newlyweds happiness and prosperity. Everything was traditional, sweet, and predictable. Finally, the host announced, "And now the floor is open to everyone who wants to congratulate our newlyweds." I got up from my seat. There was silence in the room as the guests stared in surprise at the older man, whom most of them were seeing for the first time. Damien turned pale. Celeste clenched her glass so tightly in her hand that her knuckles turned white. "Good evening," I said, pulling a file folder from my pocket. "My name is Nolan Captain. I'm the father of the groom, and I have an interesting story for you about the bride." A tense silence hung in the hall. The guests froze with their glasses in their hands, staring at me. Some looked intrigued, some embarrassed, and some clearly wondering what was going on. The musicians stopped playing. The waiters stopped in the middle of the room with trays in their hands. Even the candles on the table seemed to burn quieter than before. Damien slowly stood up from the table, his face white as chalk. Celeste continued to sit, but I could see her hands trembling, her shoulders tense under the lace bodice of her wedding dress. She looked at me with the expression of a cornered beast ready for one last fight. "Daddy," Damien said hoarsely, "what are you doing?" "What I should have done a long time ago," I answered calmly, "telling the truth." I took a step forward so all the guests could hear me well. My speech had been premeditated to the last detail. Every word, every pause. 40 years as a school principal had taught me how to speak clearly and persuasively in front of an audience. 2 years ago, I began, a woman came to my house who identified herself as real estate agent Christine Wade. She brought forged documents stating that my house was in foreclosure to build a new apartment complex. The goal was simple, to scare an elderly widower into selling the property for half of its real value. A surprised whisper was heard in the hall. Some of the guests looked at each other, not understanding what the groom's father was getting at. Others were beginning to guess and looked curiously at me and Celeste. The documents were fabricated rather crudely. I continued, opening a folder and pulling out copies of the papers. Fake seals, forged signatures of officials. When I contacted the city administration, they confirmed to me that these were forgeries. There were no plans to redevelop our neighborhood. Celeste stood up abruptly, knocking over her champagne glass. The golden liquid spilled over the white tablecloth, but no one took notice. "Nolan, stop it," she said quietly, but loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know very well," I replied, pulling out a photograph. "Here's a shot of the real Christine Wade, a licensed real estate agent. As you can see, this is a completely different woman. And here's the ID the con woman showed me. Same name, different photo." I handed the IDs to the nearest guest and they started changing hands. People were looking at the photos, comparing them, discussing among themselves what they saw. The atmosphere in the hall changed rapidly. The festive mood was replaced by tension and bewilderment. Bradley Hawkins, my former coworker, rose from his seat. "Mr. Captain, are you claiming that this woman," he pointed to Celeste, "tried to defraud you 2 years ago?" "Didn't," I corrected. "She did. Under the name Christine Wade, she came to me 3 times trying to force the sale of the house. When I realized the paperwork was fake and threatened to call the police, she disappeared." Damien took a few steps toward me. His face was contorted with anger and pain. "Dad, even if that's true, what does that have to do with Celeste? Are you accusing her of something based only on a superficial resemblance?" "Not on resemblance, son. On sheer coincidence. It's the same woman." Celeste tried to take the initiative. She walked around the table and stood next to Damien, taking his hand. Despite her pallor, she held herself with dignity. "Dear friends," she said, addressing the guests, "what you are hearing is a figment of a sick imagination. Mr. Captain is going through a difficult period in his life. The death of his wife, loneliness, age. Sometimes it leads to paranoid states where people see threats where none exist. Clever. She was trying to portray my accusations as a manifestation of senile marasmus. If I didn't have proof, the plan might have worked. An elderly man who can't accept that his son has found happiness without him is a plausible theory. I may be an aging paranoid man, I said with a slight smile, but paranoid has taped conversations with police detective Michael Green, who investigated the case. There's official expert testimony on document forgery. There are witness statements. I pulled a few more sheets out of the folder. Interrogation reports, expert reports, certificates from various institutions. All this I had collected painstakingly for 2 years, hoping that I would never need the evidence. Besides, I continued, Detective Green has informed me that the scheme used by the fraudster is not unique. Similar cases have been reported in 3 other Virginia cities in the last 5 years. The same woman has operated under different names everywhere. Excitement began in the room. The guests were talking among themselves, some of them pulling out their phones, obviously going to check my information on the internet. The atmosphere of celebration finally evaporated, giving way to curiosity and anxiety. Aunt Dorothy, who was sitting at my desk, looked shocked. "Celeste, honey, what does all this mean?" she asked in a trembling voice. Celeste didn't answer. She stood straight with her lips pressed together and looked at me with hatred. The mask of the loving bride had finally come off, revealing her true face cold, calculating, ruthless. Damien pulled his hand out of hers and turned to her. "Celeste, say something. Tell me none of this is true." She hesitated to answer for too long. At times like this, silence spoke more than any words. The guests understood it. Damien understood it. Celeste herself understood it. "Damien," she said at last, "it's not as simple as your father tells us." "Then it's true?" Her son's voice trembled. "Did you really try to deceive him?" "I was in a difficult situation. I had problems, debts. I made a mistake, but that was a long time ago, before we met." "Lies," I said calmly. "You met a month after the fraudulent scheme failed. Celeste was purposefully looking for a way to get to my house through my son. The chance meeting at the coffee shop was carefully planned." Damien backed away from his fiancée as if she were a source of contagion. "Is that true, Celeste? Did you meet me on purpose?" Celeste realized the game was lost. The lie she'd been building for 2 years was crumbling in front of everyone present, but she wasn't going to give up without a fight. "Yes, it was a calculation at first," she said sharply, "but then things changed. I fell in love with you for real, Damien. What we have between us now is real." "Real?" Damien laughed bitterly. "2 years of lies and you call that real? Every day with you has been real. Every night, every kiss, every 'I love you' I said, it was all real." There was a sepulchral silence in the hall. 200 guests watched the dissolution of a marriage that had lasted less than 3 hours. Some were taking pictures on their phones. Others were covering their faces with their hands, unable to watch someone else's drama. Damien took his wedding ring off his finger and placed it on the table. "Get out," he said quietly. "Damien, please listen to me." "Get out," he shouted so loudly that several of the guests flinched. "Get out of here now." Celeste looked around the room, all those faces full of judgment and curiosity. Her carefully constructed reputation was ruined forever. In a town where everyone knew each other, such a scandal meant the end of her career and social life. She lifted the hem of her wedding dress and walked quickly toward the exit. At the door, she stopped and turned around. "You're going to regret this, Damien. You chose a lonely old age with a paranoid father instead of a happy life with me." "Maybe," Damien replied, "but at least it will be an honest old age." Celeste disappeared out the door, and we never saw her again. I later learned that she had left Richmond that same night without even taking her personal belongings from Damien's apartment. Disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. After she left, the room was chaotic. The guests talked among themselves, speculating and exchanging opinions. Some sympathized with Damien, others condemned me for choosing such a moment to expose myself. The waiters stood to the side in confusion, unsure whether to continue serving or call it a day. Damien turned to me slowly. I read such pain and rage in his eyes that I involuntarily took a step back. "Satisfied?" he asked in an icy tone. "Damien, I did what I thought was right. Right. He stepped close to me. You ruined my wedding, humiliated me in front of 200 people, made me a laughingstock. I saved you from a mistake that could have cost you everything. Mistake? Damien laughed hysterically. The only mistake I made was inviting you to this wedding. And no, wait, I didn't invite you. You came here against my will. The guests began to slowly disperse. No one was attracted by the prospect of watching a family quarrel after such a scandal. The musicians gathered their instruments, the waiters cleared the tables. The celebration had finally turned into a nightmare. Son, I realize you're angry right now. Angry? Damien clutched his head. I am destroyed. Do you realize that? My reputation, my career, my personal life, all destroyed. And for what? For the sake of proving you were right? For the sake of keeping you from tying your life to a cheater. And now what? Now I'm left alone, deceived and betrayed. Thanks, Dad. Great wedding present. Damien turned around and walked towards the exit. At the door, he stopped and turned around. You got what you wanted. Now you have every reason to say, and I warned you. I hope it was worth losing your son forever. He walked away, leaving me alone in the nearly empty hall amidst overturned glasses, wilted flowers, and the remnants of a failed celebration. I stayed in the room for another 20 minutes, watching the waiters clean up the remnants of the celebration. The wedding cake had never been cut. It stood on a separate table, decorated with sugar roses and figures of the bride and groom. These figures now seemed a mockery of unfulfilled hopes. The waiters were carefully removing it, as if they didn't know what to do with the symbol of a broken marriage. The restaurant manager approached me with a concerned look. An elegant, middle-aged man, he clearly hadn't expected the evening to take such a turn. Mr. Captain, I'm sorry to bother you, but what should we do about the banquet? The guests have dispersed. The bride and groom have also left. Hand the bill to me, I said, pulling out my wallet. It's my responsibility. He raised his eyebrows in surprise, but didn't object. The bill was impressive, almost $15,000 for a gala that lasted less than 3 hours. I paid it off with my credit card, realizing I was spending a significant portion of my savings, but feeling it was the right thing to do. After all, I was the one who had ruined the celebration. As I left the restaurant, I met some lingering guests at the entrance. They fell silent at my appearance and turned away, signaling their disapproval of my actions. Bradley Hawkins was among them. Our eyes met, and he shook his head slowly. Mr. Captain, I understand your motives, but couldn't there have been another way? Which was? I asked earnestly. Damien didn't listen to my warnings. Celeste had a knack for persuasion. They would have gotten married, and the truth would have come out sooner or later anyway. Only it would have hurt a lot more afterward. Perhaps, but right now, your son hates you. Yeah, I agreed. Hates him now. The drive home took longer than usual. I drove slowly, taking my time, immersed in thought. It was hard on my soul, but not from regret for what I'd done. I knew I'd done the right thing. Damien's pain was acute, but temporary. The pain of living with Celeste would be chronic and devastating. At home, I changed into my home clothes and sat in the chair by the fireplace. The house greeted me with its familiar silence. But that silence was different now. It had seemed loneliness before, but now it was peace. I was alone, but I was honest with myself. I had lost my son, but I had saved him from disaster. On the coffee table was an evening newspaper with real estate ads. I flipped through it, and my gaze stopped on a familiar name. Celeste Brody is your trusted partner in the world of real estate. A picture, a professional smile, a list of accomplishments. I wondered how long this ad would hold up after today's scandal. The next few days passed in a strange calm. I did the usual things: reading, working in the garden, watching the news. The phone was silent. No one called, not Damien, not anyone I knew who might have been at the wedding. News of the scandal had obviously spread quickly through the city, but people preferred to discuss it among themselves rather than with the protagonist. On Tuesday morning, 3 days after the wedding, I received a call from Detective Michael Green. Mr. Captain, I heard about what happened on Saturday. I just wanted to clarify. You're not being threatened? People like that woman sometimes try to get revenge. No, no one is threatening me. Celeste has left town. Good. By the way, since your expose, we've been approached by 2 other victims. Elderly people who didn't dare to report to the police before. Now we have grounds for a serious investigation. So what I did had repercussions beyond the family drama. Celeste would have to answer for all her crimes, not just the attempt to deceive me. Wednesday evening, I sat on the veranda reading a book by the light of a table lamp. The October air was cool but not cold, and the last of the roses were in full bloom in the garden. Martha had always loved this time of year, golden autumn with its melancholy beauty. Autumn is a time to take stock, she used to say. What summarizing could I do now? I was alone but free of illusions. I had lost a son but retained my own dignity. I had destroyed someone else's happiness, but that happiness was built on lies. The balance was ambiguous. On Thursday afternoon, as I was watering the flowers in the garden, the mailman came to the wicket. In addition to the usual bills and advertisements, he brought a registered letter. The sender was the law firm of Smith & Partners. Inside was a notice that Celeste Brody had filed an honor and dignity suit in court. She was demanding a public apology and $100,000 in moral damages. I grinned as I read the document. Celeste wasn't going to give up without a fight, but I had all the proof I needed of her fraud, and now I had the support of the police. This lawsuit had no chance of success and was more of an attempt to scare me. Friday morning the phone rang. Damien's number popped up on the display. I stared at the ringing machine for a while, hesitant to pick up. Finally, I answered it. Dad? My son's voice sounded tired and broken. Yes, Damien. How are you doing? Disgusting. I took a leave of absence from work. Can't show my face to people. The whole company knows about what happened. I was silent, not knowing what to say. Any words of comfort would have sounded fake. Dad, I need to understand something. Were you really sure Celeste was a fraud? Or just couldn't accept that I was happy with someone else? The question was painful but honest. Damien had a right to know my true motives. I was absolutely sure. I have all the evidence I've collected for 2 years. You can look at them if you want. I've already seen them. Detective Green called yesterday, gave me the details. Celeste really is a con artist, a professional one. There was the bitterness in his voice of a man who realized he'd been duped. Damien, I know you hate me right now. I don't hate you, he interrupted. Angry, really angry. But there's no hate. That was something. I understand that you wanted to protect me, Damien continued. But why exactly like that? Why at the wedding, in front of all the people? Couldn't you have told me in private? I tried. For 2 years I tried to hint, to warn you, to explain. You wouldn't listen. Celeste was very persuasive. Yes, she was persuasive, Damien agreed bitterly. You know what the worst part is? I'm still not sure she didn't love me. Maybe it became real at some point. Maybe. But the foundation was a lie. Sooner or later, it would have collapsed. We fell silent. I could hear my son breathing heavily on the other end of the wire. Dad, I need time. A lot of time to rethink everything. I'm not ready to communicate with you right now. I understand. But I don't want you to think I hate you. It's just, I'm hurting, and I don't know how to deal with it. You will, I said with confidence. You're stronger than you think you are. We'll see. Goodbye, Dad. Goodbye, son. I hung up the phone and remained sitting in silence. The conversation went better than I expected. Damien was hurt, but not broken. Angry, but trying to understand. It was a foundation on which to build a new relationship someday, or not. But at least the son was free of lies and could build his life around the truth, even if that truth was painful. That evening, I sat in my office sorting through old documents. Among them were pictures of Damien at different times in his life. Here he is learning to ride a bike, holding my hand. Here he is in the school play. Here he is graduating from college, serious and grown up. And here's the last picture of us together, at Christmas 2 years ago, when he didn't know Celeste yet. There was distance between us then, but no open hostility. Now it was up to me to see if there was even a chance for reconciliation, or if the gulf would become insurmountable. Damien showed up at my door 2 weeks after the wedding, on a gray, rainy Tuesday evening. I heard the sound of a car in the driveway and looked out the window. His silver sedan was parked in the rain, headlights still on. He sat behind the wheel for a few minutes, obviously gathering his wits before getting out. When the doorbell rang, I was already waiting. Damien stood on the doorstep, drenched and exhausted. He'd lost a lot of weight in the past 2 weeks, dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was disheveled. His suit sat baggy on him, as if he'd lost more weight than he realized. "Hey, Dad, can I come in?" "Sure, come on in." He took off his wet coat and I hung it in the hallway. Damien made his way into the living room and stopped by the fireplace where the wood was burning. The room was lit by the soft glow of the table lamps, creating an atmosphere of coziness that contrasted sharply with the tension between us. "Would you like some coffee? Or something stronger?" "Coffee," he said without turning to me. I made my way to the kitchen and prepared 2 cups. When I returned to the living room, Damien was sitting in the chair Martha used to occupy, staring at the fire. In profile, he looked older than his 45 years. Fatigue and disappointment had stamped his face with premature maturity. "Thank you," he said, accepting the cup. We drank our coffee in silence for a few minutes, each immersed in his own thoughts. Rain drummed on the windows, wood crackled in the fireplace. The clock on the mantelpiece measuredly counted down the hours. "I quit my job," Damien said finally. It was a surprise. Damien had worked for an insurance company for over a decade, had a stable position and a good salary. Why? Couldn't stand the stares from coworkers anymore. Everyone knew about what happened at the wedding. Some sympathized, some gloated, some were just curious. Every day was turning into torture. He set the cup on the table and turned to me. "Dad, I didn't come for reconciliation. I came to understand. To understand how my own father could be so cruel to me." There was no anger in his voice, only deep fatigue and pain. "Damien, I've already explained." "No, you gave the facts. But you didn't explain why you chose to do it this way. Why didn't you talk to me alone the day before the wedding? A week in advance? A month? Why did you wait until just before the celebration?" It was a fair question, one I'd been agonizing over for the past 2 weeks myself. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," I said honestly. Celeste was very convincing. She had a knack for presenting any of my accusations as senile quirks or jealousy of your happiness. "But you didn't even try." "Tried. Many times hinted, warned, expressed doubts. You've brushed it all off." Damien stood up and paced the room, stopping at the family photos on the mantelpiece. "You know what the worst part is? That she actually loved me. At least in the last few months. I could feel it. Maybe. But love built on lies." "Don't lecture me," burst out Damien, turning sharply toward me. "Don't you dare talk to me about love. You've ruined the only close relationship I've had since my mom died." The first signs of real anger. 2 years of restraint and polite aloofness had broken through. "Damien, I understand. You don't understand anything. You live in your own world where everything is black or white, where lies are bad and truth is good, regardless of the consequences." He started pacing the room with wide steps, waving his arms. "And I live in the real world, a world where people make mistakes, where the past doesn't always determine the future, where sometimes love is more important than abstract principles. Celeste has been deceiving you since day one." "So what of it? She's changed. I've seen her change. The first few months, yes, it may have been a calculation. But then she fell in love with me for real." "How do you know?" Damien stopped and looked at me with fury. "Because I felt it. Because I knew her better than you did. Because I lived with her, not judging from the outside." He sat back in his chair and grabbed his head. "Dad, you have no idea what it's like to find out that the woman you love cheated on you from the beginning. But you know what's even worse? To find out from your own father in front of 200 people?" Tears appeared in his voice, but he held back. "If you had told me about it in private, we could have talked it over. I could have talked to Celeste, found out the truth, made a decision. But you deprived me of that opportunity. You would have believed her, not me. Perhaps, but it would have been my choice, my right to make a mistake." Damien stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the rain. "You know what I've been doing these past 2 weeks? Analyzing my and Celeste's life. Every day, every conversation, every gesture. And you know what I realized?" I remained silent, sensing I was about to hear something important. "For the last year, she's been sincere. I know that for a fact. Yes, she came to me with self-serving motives. Yes, it was initially a deception. But people change, Dad. Love changes people. He turned to me, and in his eyes I saw something new. Not anger, but deep disappointment. You killed what could have been real. For the sake of principle. For the sake of abstract justice. Damien, I wanted to protect you. From what? From happiness? From the woman who deceived you. Who cheated me in the past? The past, Dad. And the future we could have built together. He sat down again, but now he was looking directly at me. Dad, tell me honestly, were you really only thinking of my good? Or did you just not like me being happy with a woman you didn't approve of? The question hit the mark. I'd asked it to myself many times over the weeks. I don't know, I answered honestly. Probably both. Damien nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Thanks for being honest. You know, that's the first thing you've said today that I believe completely. We fell silent again. The rain intensified, turning into a real downpour. The wood in the fireplace had burned through, so I put new wood in. What's going to happen now? I asked. I don't know. I plan to leave Richmond, maybe to another state, start all over again. And us? Our relationship? Damien was silent for a long time, mulling over his answer. Dad, I can't forgive you. Not now, maybe not ever. What you did, it's not just a mistake, it's a betrayal. The word betrayal hit like a slap in the face. You betrayed my trust, my love, my right to make my own choices. You decided for me what was best for me without regard for my feelings. Damien, no, let me finish. He held up a hand, stopping me. I understand that you acted with the best of intentions. I realize you wanted to protect me, but that doesn't change the outcome. He stood up and made his way to the door. I need time, a lot of time. Maybe in a few years I'll be able to understand and forgive, but not now. At the door he stopped and turned around. Dad, I want you to know one thing. No matter what, you're still my father, and I love you, but I can't live next to you anymore. He walked away, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly seemed even emptier than before. I heard his car start as it pulled away down the wet road. The sound of the engine dissolved into the noise of the rain, and there was silence. I stayed sitting by the fireplace until well into the night, pondering my son's words. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps I had indeed denied him the right to make his own choices, even if those choices were wrong. Perhaps my being right had cost too much. But nothing could be changed. You can't undo what you've done. You can't undo what you've said. All I could do was live with the consequences of my decisions and hope that time did indeed heal all wounds. Damien left Richmond a month after our last conversation. I found out by chance when I met his former coworker at the grocery store. Robert McGill worked with his son in the same department of the insurance company and had always treated me with respect. Mr. Captain, sorry to see Damien go, he said as he stacked the purchases in the cart. Was a good worker, reliable. Said he was moving to Denver, found a new place there. Denver, 2,000 miles from Richmond, far enough away to not meet by chance, to start life over, to forget the past. Damien didn't warn me of his departure, didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a new address or phone number. He disappeared from my life as decisively as Celeste had disappeared from his. I took the news calmly, without much pain. Over the past month, I had gotten used to the idea that I had lost my son for good. The words, maybe not ever, from our last conversation proved prophetic. Damien had chosen to break up, and that was his right. That evening, I sat in my office, sorting through the paperwork that had accumulated over the years at the school. Certificates, thank you notes, graduation photos, notes from students and their parents. A lifetime devoted to other people's children. The irony of fate was that other people's children loved and remembered me, while my own son chose to forget. Among the papers, I found an old letter from Martha, written during our brief separation when we were young. Back then, I had gotten an offer to work as a school principal in another town, and we had quarreled over the move. Nolan, you always know what is right and what is wrong, she wrote, but sometimes rightness kills love. Think about it. I chose love then and stayed in Richmond. We married, lived together for 43 years, raised a son. Now at 74, I chose rightness again. And again it killed love. This time a son's love. Winter came early that year. Snow fell as early December, covering the garden with a white blanket. I no longer received Christmas cards from Damien, no longer waited for his calls. No longer bought him presents. The holidays had become just ordinary, no different than any other day. On Christmas Eve, I got a call from Bradley Hawkins, my former teacher. His voice sounded unsure, like he was questioning whether to call. "Mr. Captain, I was wondering how you were spending the holidays. Perhaps you'd like to join our family for Christmas dinner?" The invitation was unexpected, but sincere. Bradley obviously felt guilty for judging me after Celeste's exposure. Time had proven me right, and his own investigation had confirmed my words. "Thank you, Bradley, but I prefer to spend the holidays at home." "Mr. Captain, forgive me for being blunt, but don't you think isolation—" "It's not isolation," I interrupted gently. "It's a choice. I prefer solitude to bad company or imposed companionship." After the conversation, I thought about my words. Do I really prefer loneliness, or have I simply learned to put up with it? The difference was significant. Preference meant active choice. Reconciliation meant passive acceptance of the inevitable. Frankly, I didn't know the answer. Perhaps it was both at the same time. Perhaps with age one learns to find merit in any situation, even those one didn't choose. The following spring, I received a call from Detective Green. Celeste had been arrested in Atlanta on fraud charges. Her real name turned out to be Christina Webb, and she had been operating under different names in several states. The total loss from her activities exceeded $500,000. "Your exposure set off a chain reaction," the detective explained. "Many victims decided to report the crimes. Without it, she would have continued to defraud people." So my act made sense in more than just the context of the family drama. How many elderly people have I saved from being scammed? How many families had I saved from destruction? These thoughts brought some comfort, though they didn't fill the void after losing my son. Over the summer, I began writing my memoirs. Not for publication, just for myself, to reflect on my life. 40 years of work at the school, hundreds of students who passed through my hands, the joys and sorrows of pedagogical labor. My love for Martha, the birth of Damien, the gradual cooling of my relationship with my son, and finally the story of Celeste, which put an end to our family ties. Writing was difficult and liberating at the same time. Transferring memories to paper was like clearing them away, making room for new thoughts and feelings, or more accurately, to embrace the present without constantly looking back at the past. In the fall, I got a letter from Damien's lawyer. His son was selling his apartment in Richmond and asked me not to interfere with the transaction. He was also notifying me that he was relinquishing all rights to my inheritance. "Mr. Captain wishes you to dispose of your property as you see fit," the lawyer wrote in formal language. I realized this was the final goodbye. Damien had not only physically left my life, he had legally disowned the family ties. He didn't want to receive anything from the father who had ruined his happiness. Pride prevented him from accepting an inheritance from a man he couldn't forgive. Strangely, this decision brought me relief. Now there were no understatements, no false hopes of reconciliation. Everything was honest and final. We had become consenting strangers. I made a new will, leaving the house to the city to create a museum of educational history. I bequeathed money to several charitable organizations dedicated to helping the elderly. May my property benefit those who need it and not become a bone of contention in a family that no longer exists. In the winter, on the anniversary of that ill-fated wedding, I felt something resembling peace for the first time in many months. Not happiness would be the wrong word, but a certain inner balance, an acceptance of my fate without bitterness or regret. I sat by the fireplace, reading a book and drinking tea. Snow was falling outside the window, covering the world with white silence. The house was warm and cozy. Martha's roses slept in the garden until spring. The clock measured the time. No one disturbed my peace with phone calls. No one demanded explanations or excuses. Was this the life I had planned as a young man? Of course not. The plans envisioned a family, grandchildren, warm relations with my son. But life rarely goes according to plan, and wisdom lies not in stubbornly following original intentions, but in finding dignity in what has worked out. I did what I thought was right, saved my son from a cheating woman, even at the cost of losing his love. Protected others from being cheated, even at the cost of my own loneliness. I chose the truth, even at the cost of happiness. Was it the right price? Was it worth it? These questions no longer plagued me. At 75, a person has the right not to seek answers to all questions. It is enough to live honestly, to do no harm, and to find beauty in what is. The snow continued to fall, time continued to pass, and I continued to live. Alone but not broken, aged but without losing my dignity. It was my life, with all its losses and gains, and I accepted it for what it was.